She's not my Jewish mother. She's my Jewish older sister. Ambassador Ziv, rabbis, and I say rabbis plural, but I was so thrilled to see up here on the podium Chaim Mendelson, who I affectionately refer to as my rabbi. I'm not even Jewish, and I have a rabbi. Honored guests, I want to thank you for that warm welcome. I'm truly humbled to be tonight's honoree. When I came into the room earlier, I was accompanied by Oliver, our local president, and I said, wow, you've got a really good crowd here tonight. This is quite impressive. And he said, absolutely, but John, when we get a good honoree, we can get 3 times as many people out. So I appreciate the fact that he was working so hard to ensure that I was humble and kept my feet on the ground. I want to begin by thanking tonight's dinner chair, Barbara Farber, who has been, in addition to being a great older sister, has been a great friend and a supporter of mine for many, many years. I am deeply grateful to you, Barbara, to your husband, Len, to your son, Stephen, who recently served in my office, for your support, for your friendship over the years. It is deeply appreciated, especially for all of your efforts for both the Jewish community and for the general community here in Ottawa. Thank you for your great leadership. It is a tremendous honor to be an honoree at such an august gathering, and I would be very remiss if I didn't single out 3 people or groups of people for their support. First and foremost, let me say categorically that when it comes to public policy, when it comes to government, when it comes to success, it all starts with leadership. And our government, especially when it comes to the file of supporting Israel, could not have done anything without the strong, principled, real, genuine leadership that Prime Minister Stephen Harper has provided over the past 7 years. And second, especially, I'm so thrilled to be joined by so many colleagues in both the House of Commons and Senate. And if you have leadership, you've got to have people to follow. And our team has provided exceptional support for the State of Israel over the past 7 years. And I'm so grateful to call each and every one of them friends as well as colleagues, and just give a cheer to them as well. I also would like to single out someone who regrettably is not here, who recently suffered a death in his family and isn't able to join us here this evening, but someone who for the last 15 years has been not just a friend, but more importantly, has been a real mentor to me. Someone who took me to Israel almost 15 years ago, someone who has been a real tutor and mentor to me on all things Israeli, of all things Jewish, and I'm talking about my good friend, Shimon Fogel. Tonight I want to try something different. I want to depart from my traditional role as a spokesman for the government. Instead of sharing views that most of you have likely heard before, from me, from Prime Minister Stephen Harper, from my colleagues in the House of Commons and the Senate, who are all true supporters of the Jewish state, I want to share something personal, something very different. I want to share some reflections on how I became such a strong supporter of Israel and why Israel holds such a special place in my heart. At the outset, let me just say that the true friends are measured by whether they are there for you when you need them most, whether that support is steadfast, even when it's not popular or expedient. And as we've all seen, regrettably, this past week, these are indeed incredibly challenging times. The terrorist group Hamas is targeting innocent civilians with an onslaught of deadly rockets. It is a despicable act of terror, and yet, as Israel responds, as it has every right to do so, it is the target of too much condemnation. Canada, however, stands by Israel's side. Very sadly, doing so invites a litany of hatred. Just moments after I put out a statement standing with Israel on behalf of our government, supporting its fundamental right to defend itself, I received a barrage of vile reaction, most of which twisted the facts to such an extent that the truth was beyond recognition. On Twitter, one person said that I supported the burning of children in Gaza. Another accused me of playing settler colonial diplomacy with the lives of Palestinians. Views like this are rooted in ignorance or worse, much worse. In this context, my support of Israel is quite obvious, but it's an explanation that calls on me to share some of my personal history. I grew up right here, as Barbara said, in the nation's capital. It was a peaceful, middle-class upbringing. In truth, it was a privileged existence and one that I'm tremendously thankful to have had. I've lived my whole life in Nepean, but I've never had to fight to prove that I belong here, that this community defines who I am. I've never had to fight a war to defend my right, to defend my very right to live in this community. I've never been exiled from my own home or my own hometown. I've never had to rebuild my nation. I only point this out by way of contrast to the phoenix-like rising of the modern state of Israel from a barren desert to the dynamic country that we see today. After 2,000 years of bitter exile, Zionism, the national expression of the Jewish people, gave voice and shape to a dream that never left the Jewish conscience, the return of world Jewry to its ancestral homeland. It is quite simply breathtaking to behold what people like Theodore Herzl, Eli Ezer, Ben Yehuda, and Chaim Weizmann accomplished against all odds. 70 years ago, my grandfather left Canada to fight the Nazis in the Second World War. I'm deeply influenced by his contribution to combating an evil which sought to exterminate the Jewish people. That moment in history when the devil almost drove a stake through the very heart of humanity. The heavy spirit, the knotted stomach, and the paralysis of shock that I felt as I learned the details growing up of the horrors of the Nazi era have been ingrained in my soul. They shook me to my core and have become part of my DNA. To think that humankind was so vulnerable, that a sick and flawed theory on racial supremacy could use the full might and power of a large state in a twisted and depraved attempt to eradicate a whole race of fellow brothers and sisters scared me and stays with me today. My scar is merely figurative. It will never be as deep or as real as the one that left its mark on a man that I recently met in Boston, Massachusetts, a Holocaust survivor, a man who was thrown into the depths of hell and climbed back, a man who, like all European Jews, was targeted for merely existing. After I spoke to the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, this gentleman approached me and told me something that I'll never forget. He clasped my shoulder from behind, slowly shook my hand with both of his, and looked me in the eye and said, "I wish there were people like you before the war." Well, let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, I've never been more proud to be a member of Stephen Harper's team. I've never felt a greater honor to be a Canadian. I tell you this story because just as I felt honored, I also experienced deep sadness. Yes, the horrors of the Holocaust are behind this one man, but the hatred that caused it has cast itself in a very different form. Rather than target this gentleman personally, it now targets the Jewish state. That Israel is still the subject of hatred is deeply disturbing and one of the forces that drives my support for the Jewish state. In choosing not to stand idly by as the age-old hatred of the Jewish people has been transferred to the collective Jew, I have been speaking up against the new anti-Semitism that, regrettably, is so pervasive today. It targets the Jewish people by targeting the Jewish homeland as the source of all injustice and conflict in the world. It perversely couched in the language of human rights. Just as conventional anti-Semitism denied Jews the right to live as equal members of humanity, the new anti-Semitism denies the State of Israel the right to live as an equal member of the international community. It's because of this distorted thinking that over 1/4 of all UN resolutions, over 1/4 of all resolutions on human rights at the United Nations are condemning a state's human rights violations have been squarely targeted at the liberal democratic State of Israel. It purposefully blurs the lines between Palestinian civilians and Hamas terrorists. It turns a blind eye to the fact that if any other state were suffering from terrorism, as Israel does this very day, there would be no question of its fundamental right to defend itself. This is a self-evident right, indeed a responsibility in every case, except when the question turns to Israel's obligation to protect its citizens from harmful rocket attacks. In this vernacular, Israel is portrayed as the aggressor because it fits the narrative ironically echoed by so much of the media which start their stories. It all began when Israel retaliated. Worse still, when this new anti-Semitism expresses itself in the call for the destruction of Israel and the Jewish people, it is no longer hate speech. It is no longer hate speech. It is incitement to genocide. And we have to name it for what it is. We cannot dismiss the Iranian regime's calls for Israel to be wiped off the face of the earth as mere hyperbole. History has taught us that genocide is preceded by rhetoric and hyperbole. In fact, the genocidal horrors of the Holocaust were made possible by the deliberate incitement of hatred against and demonization of the Jewish people. Our job, collectively, then, is to expose this new anti-Semitism for what it is. For a country like Canada, the easy thing to do would simply be to go along to get along with anti-Israeli sentiment and to get along with other countries. It would be easier to pretend that engaging in anti-Israel rhetoric is being somehow even-handed and to excuse it under the false pretense of being an honest broker. Yes, it would be much easier for us to simply go along to get along. But as I have said frequently, Canada will no longer go along to get along, not under this Prime Minister's watch and not under this government's leadership. Canada fundamentally upholds Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state in peace and security. On this point, there is no space for moral equivocation, of ambivalence. We are compelled as a country of free citizens to speak directly and to speak honestly. We have the right and therefore the obligation to speak out and to act. Canada will not accept the attempt to judge Israel by a different standard than every other state. We will not passively observe the effort to delegitimize and isolate it within the international community. Nor will we stay silent when the Jewish state is attacked for defending its territory or its people. Canada, as has been said earlier, does no longer stand behind Israel. Canada stands shoulder to shoulder with Israel when it faces terrorism and terrorist attacks. Israel is an inspiration, the only liberal democracy in the region. It is a leading innovator in so many fields, despite so many challenges. It's a champion of civil rights in a region that far too often defines repression. Simply put, the state of Israel is worthy of our support because it is a society that shares so many similar values to Canada: freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. And I've seen this firsthand. As some, and even many of you will know, Tel Aviv is one of my most favorite cities in the world. Every time that I visit, I've always been deeply impressed with the beautiful harmony with which Jews of so many backgrounds and different levels of observance live together. A city that coexists, as its official name, Tel Aviv Jaffa, with an Arab minority. I can recall one Friday afternoon standing on the junction where the Carmel Market and the Schenken Street meet, watching the microcosm of Israel playing itself out, Jews and Arabs alike interacting in the market. Young secular men putting on tefillin at Chabad booths, people who were free to love who they love without any fear of repression. As I took this all in, it reaffirmed what I already knew, that those who label Israel a racist state are simply flat out wrong. Earlier, I talked about the phoenix-like rising of Israel. Of course, we can't talk about making something spectacular with nothing more than a vision without talking about Tel Aviv and Mir Dizengoff. He was a man with a bold vision to build a new Jewish city out of almost nothing, a city that I might add that couldn't have been built without funds raised by the JNF. He and Tel Aviv symbolized the birth of the Jewish people in their historic homeland. As a city that absorbed so many Jews who survived the Holocaust, Tel Aviv's founders built a city that became the financial and cultural center of a nation reborn. This is not merely a commercial place, but an emotional place, bearing a cosmopolitan presence mingled with pioneering memories. Which gets me to the focus of this evening's celebration, the important role that the Jewish National Fund plays. Its contributions to the State of Israel are deeply connected with its rebirth. The JNF is unparalleled in its work, both in the historical role it has played in the very creation of Israel and the role it continues to play in bettering the quality of life within Israel for all, rural and urban Israelis alike, Jewish, Arab, and Christians alike. I wouldn't know as much as I do without the work of this organization, were it not for my personal friendship with your National Director, Josh Cooper, someone who's been a friend of mine for more than a decade. I commend the leadership of JNF for having selected such a capable and dynamic individual to lead such a great organization here in Canada. I'll conclude by looking forward. More than 60 years ago, Israel appeared as a light in a world emerging from darkness. Against all odds, and despite concerted efforts by some, the light has not been extinguished. It burns still. And it burns even brighter when upheld by the principles of freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. There is room for more light in the world, especially as the darkness that's swirling around the region and uncertainty that threatens to close in. Working together, we strengthen and affirm these important principles, not just in word, but in deed. And we declare our choice to use our freedoms and our shared humanity for good. May that light shine ever brighter. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.